This morning, we are going to try and learn something about the impact of aid on reforms, specifically what I refer to as economic freedom. So, I have 8 sections. Specifically, we will first find out what economic freedom is in terms of importance, and what are the implications of aid for economic freedom. I reviewed the literature quite briefly, and then I'll advance a new hypothesis, maybe. We will then look at the trends in economic freedom, in external aid, and then I'll provide what the lawyer didn't want to see: cross-country regression results and panel regression results. Then at the end, I'll provide a summary and conclusion. Well, to say that the debate in terms of the effectiveness of aid has been vigorous is an understatement. But I read something here recently, and I quote, "Aid has a positive and significant causal effect on growth in the long run." Well, I don't think Bill Easterly will be too happy with this statement. And so the debate obviously continues. But I think an important question here is, what's the channel by which growth might affect growth to begin with? And one possibility might be through promoting growth-enhancing policies, reforms. That is economic freedom. And yesterday, you may recall that we were talking about governance and how you could use governance to do the right thing, to provide social protection, other kinds of things. And here, we're talking about economic governance. Well, it is good news that many African countries have indeed attained growth resurgence. And I think the lingering question is whether the resurgence will indeed continue. And so I think it's appropriate to ask the question, can aid help? And in that regard, specifically, can it help through improving economic freedom? Well, let's look at the recent economic history, then to find out whether indeed that is the case. First, what is economic freedom? We are going to now use the Fraser Index of Economic Freedom, which consists 5 areas in terms of the size of government, legal structure and security, property rights, the kinds of things that the lawyer was talking about earlier, access to sound money, freedom to exchange with foreigners, yes, foreigners, along with domestic agents, regulation of credit, labor, and business. These are the 5 areas. We take the weighted average of these 5 areas, we get an index for economic freedom, EF, and the index goes from 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. But is economic freedom important, after all? Is it? A number of studies have indeed found that economic freedom can improve well-being, and I think that it would not be a surprise to learn that Milton Friedman, as far back as 1958, did talk about economic freedom not only as a means to an end, but an end in itself. And furthermore, economic freedom might indeed promote political freedom. So, it is important then to talk about economic freedom. Then the question becomes, how about the impact of aid on economic freedom? Well, a number of studies have argued that aid has indeed reduced economic freedom. What can prove that? Friedman is one of them, and Easterly and the World Bank have indeed argued in that direction. And Heckelman, Nack, and some others have also argued with very strong empirical studies. And Collier has tried to explain one of the reasons why that might be the case. What happens is that countries may engage in freedom in economic reforms, and then they want aid, so they wait, and then they try to attract more aid and so on, and as a result, that tends to retard economic freedom. But does this necessarily have to be the case? This is the making of new hypothesis that suggests that maybe as a result of the end of the Cold War, aid is no longer being provided for geopolitical reasons, and that donors have become more selective in terms of the supply of aid. It is also quite possible that African governments have become more development-minded, maybe. And despite all the negative stories about aid conditionality, it may actually work in terms of getting countries to implement reforms. Indeed, aid could be quite complementary to reforms. There's a case in Ghana where more aid was required to reduce the negative impacts of structural adjustment. Otherwise, that reform probably would have fallen apart. And it's also quite possible that the effect of aid may be delayed. It could be an investment. Aid is provided in the 1980s. It may turn out that the effect of aid then on reform might not be seen until the 1990s or thereafter. But now let's take a look at the trends in economic reform in terms of economic freedom. The red one is for the world in terms of other developing countries. The blue one is sub-Saharan African countries. And by the way, there are 74 developing countries here, and there are 28 African countries. It's interesting to note that in 1980, it looked as if we were quite close. And then things seem to have fallen apart in the 1980s, yeah? And then things began to pick up again in terms of increased economic freedom in around the mid-1990s. And now we've come close once again between Africa and the rest of the developing world. But that's very gross, isn't it? It's a very aggregate picture. We can look at country-specific data. If we go back to 1980, countries like Cameroon, Mali, South Africa, Mr. Lawyer, it is certainly not surprised to have South Africa up there. Botswana, as usual, the darling. And we can go all the way toward the bottom. We have Ghana, Uganda, way down there. That's bad news. These days, when anyone thinks about Ghana, the person is going to say Ghana's down there in economic freedom. Of course not. 2010, indeed, Ghana's way up there, and so is Botswana, for instance. Zimbabwe. Well, is there a surprise? Now, in 1980, Zimbabwe was about number 15, and that is all the way down there. If you look at the change in economic freedom, indeed, Ghana and Uganda are tops. Namibia also is, and so on. And now the bottom, Zimbabwe. Congo Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Cameroon. Choose your country. Select one. If we look at the world rankings, we find that Angola, Zimbabwe, most of the countries at the bottom are African countries. That's a surprise. In the top, most of the countries are non-African, but Mauritius is there, so at least we are represented. Now we can look at the trends for Ghana, and what I want to emphasize here, because it's not clear that there's any real correlation or movement, co-movement, but there seems to be some front-loading of aid between, say, 1985 and 1990. and the same time that we also ended up with improvement, significant improvement, gradient in economic freedom. Of course, one has to be careful not to engage in the usual post hoc ergo propter hoc trap situation. And for Uganda, we observed something similar. It looks as if the increase in aid actually happened much faster than economic freedom, which seemed to have picked up around 1990, around the time of the reforms. Well, we can look at the overall ODA over time, yearly. This is yearly, so we can tell a better picture in terms of what is going on in Ghana. And again, we find out that indeed ODA increased substantially until about the end of the 1990s. And then actually until the end of the 1980s, then it began to taper down. Similarly, for Uganda, we have until the early 1990s, then it began to taper down. This African story in terms of aid, here we have until close to the mid-1990s, then aid began to fall, and then it began to increase again later on. In part as a result of the RDI, this multilateral debt relief. Now, the cross-country OLS results. The first thing that I try to do here is to duplicate the previous results. And it's very clear that aid in the 1980s was negative. The impact of aid was negative in the 1980s. There's no pointer here. Just for the case. No. Anyway, for the benefit of those individuals who may not be familiar with regression analysis, the coefficient is negative and the t-value is quite high in magnitude. So that suggests that the impact of aid in the 1980s was negative. By the way, there are other variables also included in the cross-country analysis. I think there's a handout that lists a number of the variables, including initial economic freedom, including initial democracy, change in democracy, and initial income, change in income, linguistic fractalization, and a whole bunch of other variables. So these are partial effects, by the way. Okay? And it also turns out, if you look at the second equation, the second column, that most of the impact really is due to aid in the 1980s. Okay, the negative impact. So the 1980s obviously were a problem, according to this result. But again, remember that this is the change in economic freedom between 1980 and 2000. Okay? I extended the sample period from 1995 to 2005. So in the 1990s, I looked at whether indeed the effect of aid has been positive or negative. Well, the first column seems to indicate that this is significant during that period. The second column suggests that if we break up the period from 95 to 99 and 2000 to 2004, 5, again, it is insignificant. So we moved away from a situation where the aid was negative, the effect of aid was negative, to a situation where the effect of aid is what? Insignificant. In column 3, I tested the hypothesis, might the effect of aid be delayed? And that suggests that aid in 80-89 indeed has a positive impact on economic freedom, change in economic freedom between 1995 and 2005. So the effect of aid has been delayed, it suggests, and it's positive. In column 4, let me move to column 5. If we look at the whole, the half-decadal period, 80 to 94, again, we find out that the aid is positive. The effect of aid is positive. So the result here is that the impact of aid has been what? Delayed. So now we say, look, let's study the 5-year panel. So I took the whole period, divided into half-decadal panel data. Under fixed effects, and this is an example situation where the initial economic freedom was included. And what I want to emphasize here is that if we look at the panel, the contemporaneous effect happens with the period 1995 to 2000. That is the only period where the contemporaneous effect of aid is positive. But it is positive. Random effects results confirm the fixed effects result. And this is a slightly different specification because you don't have the initial economic freedom in the regression equation. And the estimated effect is about the same. Now, those of us who tend to believe strongly in econometrics then say, well, now wait a second. How do we know that aid is not endogenous in the specification? And as a result, we have spurious results. Well, it is quite possible, especially in this situation where you have initial level of economic freedom included in the specification, in the equation. So I think that we have to be a little bit more thorough. So we use what they call the system panel GMM estimation. Sorry, Mr. Lawyer, I'm talking over your head. And in the fifth equation, we find that indeed the effect of aid, 1995-2000, is positive and significant, very much like the other results. So that suggests that the results tend to be robust. So now a summary of the findings and conclusions. Well, first, the cross-country results suggest that the 1980s witnessed a negative impact of aid on the change in economic freedom, but it was contemporaneous. Okay? So in other words, if we look at aid in the 1980s, and you look at economic freedom, change in economic freedom in the 1980s, you find that the effect is indeed negative. However, when we did the sample for the mid-1990s and beyond, we did find that perhaps it wasn't a wasted effort in the 1980s after all. And that the effect of aid was actually quite delayed. And during the post-period, 1995 to 2005, that aid indeed became effective in terms of improving economic freedom. That's the cross-country results. And from the panel results, again, we find out that if we look at the contemporaneous correlation, that is the aid in 1994 to 2000, and the change in economic freedom over the similar period, indeed that effect is positive and significant. So the conclusion here is that the relationship is much more complicated than the previous results were portraying for Heckelman and Knack and all these other people were trying to tell us. So let us not be too simplistic. But of course, just like anything else, we can label these results as preliminary. More work is required, obviously, for understanding why these results hold. And also, remember, we talked about the fact that other variables were being controlled in the specifications, such as initial democracy and change in democracy. And additional experimentation suggests that indeed aid might have a positive impact on changes in democracy. And if that is the case, then the total effect of aid on economic freedom might actually be larger than anticipated. So, ladies and gentlemen, we should be very happy that Bill Easterly is not in here in the audience. Well, let me the other way out. Bill Easterly should be very happy that he's not here today. And that is really the picture of aid might actually be brighter than we thought previously. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.